Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Jeremy Dawson, the Policy and Program Specialist at NAST, and I'd like to welcome everyone to today's webinar on the Global Economic Update. I hope everyone's doing well, and I want to thank you all out there for tuning in this afternoon. This is the last in our TMTS 2.0 webinar series where we've rebooted 4 sessions from July's Treasury Management Training Symposium for attendees and newcomers alike. We hope you've enjoyed the whole lineup, and if you missed a session or want to revisit any of NAST webinars, please visit our webinar archive, which is available under the Media tab on the NAST site, nast.org. Please note that this webinar is being recorded and will be posted to that webinar archive as well. So I'm going to provide a brief run through of the features that we have available. So in the handouts section, you can download a copy of the slide deck being used today, as well as our speakers' bios. And we also encourage you to interact with us and our speakers by typing your questions into the box in the questions section at any time during the presentation. And we'll present these at the end of the formal presentations. We do have this webinar scheduled for an hour and a lot of great content to get through. So on behalf of NAST, the Banking and Cash Management Committee, and the State Debt Management Network, I'd like to welcome and thank our speakers for presenting to our membership and our attendees for joining us. Christina, I will turn the floor over to you.
Great. Thank you so much, Jeremy. It is such a pleasure to be with you all today. What I thought I would do is take you through this slide deck. I'll give greater emphasis to that, which I believe is more important, but of course we're going to leave enough time at the end for questions, so don't hesitate to ask me on anything I've covered or haven't covered in this presentation. All right, let me get started by talking about my base case. And the base case is that we are going to see continued strength in global growth. However, that comes with, of course, caveats. Risks have increased and there's greater divergence. But let me start by saying that I would expect that we see global growth in 2018 around 3.8, 3.9%, and that we're likely to see a slight deceleration in that in 2019, but still in certainly the mid to high threes. But as I mentioned, it's a different environment than it was last year. You may have heard the term synchronized global growth. I think that was used, overused, arguably, to characterize the economic environment last year. It's changed since then. Certainly, we're seeing many countries experiencing growth this year, but it's not synchronized, and of course, some countries are experiencing a lag. This heat map was taken from the IMF, and they do a great job of illustrating what growth looks like if we were to look at the entire map. And as you can see, virtually everywhere is green or blue. And green, of course, represents growth, significant growth, the darker the green. The blue represents relatively low growth. But what you can see is very little tan, and that represents negative growth in GDP. And so this picture is very different. It's certainly positive, and it's very different than what we saw just 2 years ago, which I share on this slide just for some frame of reference. And so the environment has certainly improved over the last few years globally. Of course, helping that along has been extremely accommodative monetary policy, but there's more to it than that. This has been organic growth, and many countries have participated in it. The base case, of course, is that that continues at a strong pace this year, a slightly less strong pace next year. But as I mentioned, growth is not synchronized. In fact, if we were to dive down and look at individual economies, what we'd see is some that are what you would characterize as late cycle in terms of economic growth, and some that are just beginning. And so I share 4 countries just to give a sense of where they are. This, I apologize, is a few months old. So if we were to add up the numbers right now, the U.S. is in 110 months of an economic expansion. And we'll talk about that in a little while in more detail. But the key takeaway from this is that typically economic expansions in the U.S. Have lasted for far shorter periods of time. The average is in the 50s in terms of months of economic expansion. Now, of course, this was an unusually elongated expansion because it began inorganically with experimental monetary policy. And of course, at some point, it shifted into a more normal economic recovery. But that helps explain why it's so elongated. However, I think it's important to stress that it's getting close to late cycle if it's not already late cycle. Japan, certainly a lengthy economic expansion. Eurozone, a lengthy economic expansion. Japan did have a blip where it didn't expand in the second quarter, for a few months in the first quarter, but it has picked up since then. Brazil is only beginning its economic expansion. And again, I can't stress enough that with economies in very different stages of growth, this is not a synchronized global growth environment. What's more is that we have some economies decelerating and some economies accelerating. So I share this as just a snapshot of the changes in IMF forecasts. The IMF put out forecasts again in July, and those show more changes. Some economies, of course, are expected to accelerate from here. Some are expected to see a small deceleration in growth. Now, if we were to dive down into the Eurozone, that also, I would argue, gives us a good sense of just how disparate different economies are within the same region. And I think it also helps explain why there have been so many tensions within the Eurozone. What you see here is essentially the recovery that was experienced by different countries within the Eurozone post-global financial crisis. And so as we can see, Germany, France, and the Benelux economies led the recovery. While Spain lagged for a good while, it has picked up quite significantly in the last 2 years. And of course, progress in Italy has been very disappointing and still below its pre-crisis peak, which I think helps explain why we're seeing so much in the way of geopolitical disruption within Italy, why there are still many question marks about whether or not there will be a quit Italy. The Eurozone is a big place, and there are a lot of differences in economies. And it's actually a wonder that they've been able to hold together a monetary union without a fiscal union. Now, in the UK, it's a very different situation. The UK economy was in a good place. And then, of course, the UK voted for a Brexit. And that's created a lot of economic policy uncertainty, particularly most recently, given that we're getting closer and closer to the exit date of March 2019. I can't stress enough how problematic economic policy uncertainty can be, because historically, there's a pretty significant negative correlation between economic policy uncertainty and capital investment. Companies don't want to spend and invest if they don't have visibility on policy. And I can't think of a greater example of having a lack of visibility than the UK right now, in that they do not have a deal with the European Union in terms of what their relationship will be post-Brexit. And the clock is ticking. They really need to have a deal hammered out by October in order to enable the UK to get all the member countries of the European Union to ratify by the March 2019 Brexit date, which is set in stone. So we're finally having a lot of politicians coming out and saying more transparently that the odds are increasing that there is a no-deal Brexit. If there is a no-deal Brexit, and of course as we hurtle closer to the potential for a no-deal Brexit, we're likely to see a continued drop in spending because companies just have no idea what's going to happen. Now, Of course, over the longer term, I think the UK economy will do just fine, but we're in a very problematic period. And I certainly wouldn't want to be making decisions at the BOE right now just because of all the issues that they face. Inflation created by the drop in currency, as well as a tepid economic environment, spells a quandary for the BOE in terms of what to do. If we turn to Japan, actually the situation has improved somewhat. Japan has a lot of headwinds, and demographics and debt are at the top of the list. But, of course, it also has incredibly accommodative experimental monetary policy that's helping, as well as generally a very low unemployment rate that's gotten lower in recent years. And so the Japanese economy is doing okay right now. And we just want to follow it closely. It's a fairly steady, low growth environment. I don't expect any kind of significant burst in growth, nor do I expect the economy to fall into recession anytime soon. Although I think it's important to note that we do have elections coming up soon in Japan. And Abe is not extremely popular. I think he's done a fairly good job in terms of executing on some of his three arrows, but not all. And so he certainly is at risk. My base case is that he maintains his leadership in Japan, but this is not an environment where he's going to be able to deliver on his promises. If we turn to emerging markets, what we see is some pretty significant differences here as well. So I pulled out the BRIC countries and then, of course, compare them to emerging markets in general. And so, of course, growth forecasts are strong and improving when it comes to India. Growth forecasts are strong and decelerating when it comes to China. China, of course, is a far larger economy than India, representing 38% of total GDP within the emerging market space. So we need to recognize that we're seeing some changes occurring. India is positioned to see growth accelerate from here because it's done a lot of the groundwork in terms of laying out reforms. So it's in a good place. Brazil and Russia are, as you saw from an earlier slide, Brazil is just coming out of a recession. It's about 8 months into an economic expansion. And so growth is relatively low, but expected to accelerate. Russia's facing some strong headwinds from sanctions, and so there are question marks about economic growth going forward. Now let's take a deep dive into the United States. As I mentioned, the average number of months in an expansion is 58. We're at 110 months right now. The longest economic expansion has been something like 116, 117 months in the U.S. That doesn't mean that the economy stops expanding at 117 months, but it does mean that we're probably experiencing some pretty extraordinary economic growth. And that makes sense, just given the nature of this economic recovery, first fueled by monetary policy, completely artificial, I would argue. And at some point, we saw more organic growth kick in. And now, as the economy might be beginning to falter, it actually got a big injection from tax reform. And that has renewed its strength, and I think has given it a longer lifespan. So we'll want to follow this closely. But I would expect that the first time we run into a real risk of an economic deceleration or recession isn't until the back half of 2019. And that would be the first time I think we would encounter a significant possibility of a deceleration that's significant or a recession. Now, I mentioned tax reform. I do think it is the gift that keeps on giving. As far as legislation goes, I would not give it an A grade. I think, I'd probably grade it at a B or a B minus in terms of the use of government funds to essentially stimulate the economy. I always refer to multiplier effects and just how impactful individual line items of spending are. This tax reform package was very, very positive in terms of the aspects of it that helped companies. What we saw was an incentivization of capital spending. We saw cutting of overall tax rates in a way that finally made the U.S. Competitive with most other countries. I think where it fell short was in terms of household tax reform. Just that the higher income households received a big majority of the benefits. And so that, unfortunately, means that we're not going to see as much in the way of economic stimulus as a result. But luckily, companies have been spending, they've been incentivized, and so it has had an impact on, I apologize for moving these slides. It has had an impact on the economy. And this slide shows you projections from the Congressional Budget Office. And as you can see, the greatest impact on GDP doesn't occur by the CBO's estimates until 2022. And so it's this kind of stimulus that can really extend an economic expansion and also cushion a downturn when it occurs. So what might have been a recession could just become a deceleration. So just something to keep in mind. Now, of course, there's no free lunch. And so I included this slide here, which shows the kind of debt we're taking on. And of course, this isn't all due to tax reform legislation. That only added a couple trillion to the overall tax bill. But what we do see is because of all government spending that's expected to accelerate in the next decade, we are going to go from $15 trillion to $27 trillion in terms of debt in just a decade. And don't forget, this is going to be complicated and aggravated by the fact that borrowing costs are going up. So the CBO has projected that borrowing costs in 10 years will be 3.4% versus just 2% today. So that will only add to the headwinds facing the U.S. as it tries to tackle its debt issues. So it's something to think about. Again, it's a headwind that we don't necessarily have to worry about today, but will be a very significant one as we go forward, especially as the Fed continues to normalize monetary policy. Now, one question we always get is about the yield curve. And what does it mean if the yield curve inverts? Does that automatically presage a recession? What I would argue is that inverted yield curves don't cause recessions, but they are symptomatic. What it shows is that there is no confidence in the future if we see an inverted yield curve. There is no premium, essentially, out there for the longer term. And so it's not surprising that the last 6 or so recessions were accurately predicted by an inverted yield curve. But I have to give the caveat that that doesn't necessarily mean we are going to see a recession anytime soon. In fact, from the data of inversion, it on average takes 21 months to see a recession start. So the U.S. has some time. Now, some people think this is just nonsensical, and you shouldn't pay attention to the yield curve because it's not a cause of a recession. So you could potentially avoid it, even if investor preferences suggest there's fear about the future. But I would argue that we need to pay attention to the possibility for an inverted yield curve just because the Fed's paying attention to it. And that might alter Fed behavior. We've seen it come up in FOMC minutes recently. This is a topic that is on the minds of FOMC participants. Not necessarily Jay Powell per se, but certainly bank presidents, the regional bank presidents, who have business contacts, that have business leaders in their regions that worry about it. In fact, we see them relaying that back to the FOMC. And so for that reason alone, we do want to keep our eyes on it. Now, Larry Kudlow has argued that we're not looking at the right yield curve, that too many people are looking at the differences between the 2 and the 10-year, which I guess if he saw this chart, he'd say I'm making a mistake in sharing this with you. What I should show you instead is the spread between the 3-month and the 10-year. Now, that spread is definitely bigger than the spread between the 2 and the 10-year, but it's the same idea, and that spread is narrowing as well. So we just want to follow that closely. Now, this is a great segue into key risks, and I would argue that there are really 4 key risks. There are 2 key risks to global growth, and those are protectionism and rising debt levels. So, sorry about that. I have a slippery finger on the mouse. So, protectionism. I can't say enough bad things about protectionism. Maybe it's been too many economics classes that I've taken that make me shudder to think about the potential. But what we know is that in the 1930s, the 1920s and 1930s, globally, we entered an environment of tariff wars. And that while they didn't cause the Great Depression, they greatly exacerbated the Great Depression. And that was actually when world trade as a percentage of GDP was far smaller than it is today. And I can't stress that enough. So markets, from my perspective, are ignoring the very serious threat of trade wars. The fact that so many of the questions that Jay Powell received in his Humphrey Hawkins testimony were around tariffs. Congress people brought up that topic because they're hearing that from their constituents, and for the most part, it's business leaders in those regions. We saw talk about it in the June FOMC meeting minutes, where participants shared that business contacts are worried about trade wars and are either postponing or foregoing capital investments. So there it is again, that concept of economic policy uncertainty and how it negatively impacts capital investment. And even Jay Powell in his testimony admitted there's a growing chorus of concern. That's a quote from him. So what we need to watch, of course, is if it shows up in the data. I think it will start to show up in the data. We're certainly already seeing it show up in terms of input costs. But beyond that, I would just say just a few thoughts on protectionism. There is an assumption that China will lose to the U.S. in a trade war. I think that is a mistaken assumption because China can inflict a lot of damage on the U.S. and it has a broader arsenal of weapons. It can depreciate the yuan. It can stop buying U.S. treasuries and or sell existing U.S. treasuries, and it owns a lot of them. That would drive up our borrowing costs. It could encourage North Korea to antagonize the U.S. Keep in mind that it has tried to help smooth the relationship between the U.S. and North Korea. It could use that as a weapon as well. Foreign policy can often become intertwined with monetary policy. It can create closer trading relationships with other countries. In fact, China this summer made overtures to the EU for a closer relationship. It's done the same thing to the UK. It can also provide economic subsidies for Chinese companies. Or Chinese sectors. It could also make it more difficult for U.S. companies to do business in China, which scares them. Blocking U.S. companies from access, higher taxes on U.S. companies, a regulatory crackdown on U.S. companies. Think, for example, of anti-monopoly investigations. It could just make it harder to do business and really shake down U.S. companies. And then finally, I would say China can play the long game. Don't forget, President Xi, as of last year, is now president for life. He's not just in there for 10 years. Versus the U.S., which has to play a very short game, think midterm elections. And of course, the electoral map is a big Achilles heel that not only China is exploiting, but other countries are exploiting as a result of the trade wars. So, what I would just say is, again, it can impact the U.S. in several different ways. First of all, If the U.S. is applying tariffs on Chinese goods, but they're not easily substitutable, that just means that the tariffs get passed on to U.S. consumers in the form of higher prices. And that'll, of course, cut down on what they can spend elsewhere. So this great consumer renaissance that we're experiencing right now could go away relatively quickly as a result of that. In addition, in some cases, it can create demand destruction. For those items that consumers don't necessarily need to buy right now, they could pass on it. In fact, we are already seeing that happen with washing machines. Well, that was one of the first tariffs applied, was on washing machines, and we've seen a big drop in sales, and we've seen an increase in prices as a result. So demand destruction can't be ignored. And then, of course, there's also the tariffs on raw materials. So they become part of the input cost to companies. Now, companies could either pass them on to consumers, or in some cases, they have to eat it because they don't have enough leverage to increase prices, which will narrow profit margins. So there are a lot of ways that tariffs can be really problematic. Now, let me just move on quickly to another key risk, which is debt. Sorry again about the slides. So what we're seeing is, in general, debt is going up. That's true for governments. That's true for households. That's true just in general for emerging markets as well as developed markets. U.S. government debt to GDP is growing. Canadian household debt to GDP. Canadians have historically been far more prudent financially than U.S. households, and debt has gone up significantly. We just have to follow this closely because as rates go up, this creates more and more of a squeeze and, of course, precludes greater spending because consumers, households, corporations are under pressure. So again, not an immediate risk, but one we need to think about for the longer term. Now, there are also a few risks to financial markets, one being monetary policy normalization. That's really the other key risk other than protectionism, because we've been in an environment of unnaturally low rates, incredible monetary accommodation for so many years, and now it's changing. The U.S., of course, is out ahead of the pack in terms of normalization, and we're actually using two policy tools at once. We're raising the Fed funds rate, and we're also normalizing the balance sheet. So that means that monetary policy, which is never a surgical tool, it's a blunt instrument, becomes all the more unwieldy when you're utilizing two tools at once. And we're also, of course, moving much more rapidly than other countries, some of which are still very accommodative, like the Bank of Japan, which has the potential for disruption. But in general, what I would say is balance sheet normalization. We took the Fed's balance sheet from $800 billion to $4.6 trillion in just a few years. Now we're trying to unwind that. Unwinding an experiment is an experiment in and of itself, and so we have to recognize that that can create disruption. We're already hearing from emerging markets that that is creating disruption. It's creating a liquidity suck. So we want to follow that closely. Keep in mind that when we were increasing the Fed's balance sheet through QE, that positively impacted the stock market. So we'll want to watch to see if this negatively impacts the stock market. So there's certainly risks there. And our last risk is really one of inflation, one of, in particular, input costs increasing and narrowing profit margins because, again, many companies might not be able to pass on inflation. So how are companies going to see inflation? Well, they can certainly see it, as I mentioned, from tariffs. I also think we're going to see it from wage growth. It's going to be a uniquely U.S. problem for right now because we're just not seeing any kind of inflationary pressures in other countries. But it's something to watch for, especially since really such a strong earnings season has helped keep companies very buoyant in the stock market. And so we could see some problems if we see narrowing profit margins going forward. So my apologies for running over, but I'll stop there.
Thank you, Christina. And if you have any questions for Christina, be sure to type those into the questions box. and we will address those at the end of Stephanie's presentation. Stephanie?
Great, thank you. And now I will progress these slides over to the muni section. And the back one, there we go. Here we have Invesco's footprint when it comes to the municipal space. We do manage $30.1 billion in municipal products for investors globally across various investment vehicles. U.S. municipal mutual funds being the largest of that, 56%. In that space, we are the 7th largest municipal fund manager at about over 120 managers. So we are a pretty significant player in the tax-exempt as well as taxable municipal space. Now, I will touch a bit on the market environment. So here we have the ownership of municipal securities, $3.8 trillion market, very much continues to be dominated by retail. We see retail holding municipal bond securities in either mutual funds, ETFs, and other vehicles, but currently we're still in a space where retail dominates this market. In the last few years, we have seen some changes to legislation, some changes to, I think globally things have impacted the demand pattern of munis in a way that we've never seen before. We kind of have to go back to 2013 when this all began, which was we had the taper tantrum in the spring. We had Detroit file for bankruptcy in June of 13, and then we had the Puerto Rico on the cover of Barron's in July. I may have flip-flopped Detroit and Puerto Rico there. But all three of those, they were really the perfect storm. And the result was significant spread widening in munis and a pretty strong sell-off in the space. And at that point in time, I started receiving quite a few inquiries from many of our salespeople that had been getting inquiries from their institutional foreign clients. So you had banks, insurance companies in Asia. Predominantly, initially, this conversation began with Japan for us here at Invesco. And they just wanted to understand more about this asset class. It really took, it's taken really almost 4 years to get them, I think to a place where they are comfortable enough to invest. But now we have a additional demand base from foreign owners that we've seen grow. And we've actually seen a 30% increase in the last 2 years or so from foreign buyers. At Invesco, we currently manage accounts for Korean insurance companies, Japanese banks. We also have a Japanese mutual fund, which buys U.S. municipal bonds. So we're definitely in a different space when it comes to munis, and I think that it makes for a very interesting market at this point in time, especially as we consider many of the tax changes that took place at the corporate level that may impact both the holdings of insurance companies and banking financial institutions. And the following slide touches on the insurer demand. So while we did see some changes in the tax reform bill at the end of 2017 that are likely to impact property casualty insurers' purchases of munis going forward, we don't believe we're going to see a mass exodus of these buyers from the market. We don't think that we're going to see them selling into the market. We do believe that demand going forward, however, could be significantly impacted. A good reason for this is really that when it comes to these types of investors, typically they are looking at the book yield that they were able to purchase securities at. And unless they are able to replace that book yield with something else in the market, they're likely to hold on to those holdings. But going forward, we expect to see that demand from P&C insurers decrease. Now, on the flip side, life insurers are expected to come into the market in a larger size. This is really because under the tax reform bill, 93.7% of muni income is now tax-free to these types of buyers. So there's an idea here that these two may actually result in a bit of a wash where, you see the PNCs no longer buying in size, but the life insurers may be able to come in and make up for the buying that the PNCs would have done had the tax reform not taken place. And on the following slide, we really have here an illustration of what's been driving munis in 2018. And this is really the technical picture. When it comes to the municipal bond market, the technicals and who buys munis and predominantly the retail investor has typically been a driver of performance and a driver of overall liquidity in the market. And the changes that we had to tax reform at the end of 17 really set the tone for what we're currently seeing and have been seeing this year in 2018. And that was really, as we got towards the end of last year, the idea that tax reform was more than likely going to happen became more and more clear. And the idea that private activity issuers, as well as advanced refunding, may no longer be available on a tax-exempt basis. That really, began to spook many of the municipal issuers, and so we had the largest issuance month that we've ever seen in the history of munis at $62.5 billion in the month of December 17. What that did is it really took the bulk of the issuance that we expected to see in 2018 out of this year. And so what we have seen is issuance right now at through the end of July, $190 billion. That compares to a year ago where we were about $265 billion. And if we look at total year issuance in 2016, we were about $445 billion, and 2017 we were just about $440 billion. The expectation for 2018 is that we'll likely come in somewhere between 320 to 335 billion. So a distinct drop in issuance of munis year over year, really because of what we saw at the end of last year. And this lack of issuance has really led to some pretty good outperformance in the muni space. High yield munis had a pretty good second quarter. Investment grade was also positive, and that's been in the midst of some rate volatility. But in the muni space, because of the lack of issuance and the strong demand, we've seen right now through the end of last week about $11 billion worth of net inflows into municipal mutual funds. So that technical picture has definitely been a tailwind for munis here year to date. And the low issuance and this high demand has really resulted in continued tightening of spreads. And here we're looking at BBB and high yield rated issues, where we're seeing both spreads well inside of their 20-year average. So, municipals right now definitely are a bit tight, but the interesting thing is that when we look at the curve for munis, there's still a pretty steep slope. So we do believe that there is some value to be had in the municipal space. Now, on this particular slide, we're looking at the credit curve for munis, and the blue shaded area is really where at Invesco, we're able to make the best use of our credit analysis staff. We do have a team of 14 analysts. They're internally rating every single security that we're buying. But what we're looking at in that BBB and BB space typically are non-rated issuers. In our high yield products, we happen to run a high yield product that's almost $10 billion, second largest in the industry. And that fund does significantly invest in non-rated exposure. And in that part of the market, that's where we feel you're able to get the most bang for your buck. If you're doing that due diligence, for us, that includes a site visit, that includes going out to these projects. We generally haven't been big buyers of GOs, to be honest. We tend to overweight essential service revenue bonds. In the high yield funds, we'll have some project revenue credits. But for us, we believe that when these bonds are coming non-rated, we're able to negotiate terms on these deals. We're able to get a seat at the table. It just gives us a little bit more control in terms of the exposures that we're taking. And so, what we're finding right now is that that 95 basis point yield gain that you can get going from the BBB to the BB is really what we're looking to capture and what we've been able to capture in both of our high yield products. And when we look at the non-US investor, I mentioned that particularly, the demand started in Japan. It's now moved past that. As I mentioned, we run an account for a Korean insurer, so we've seen, demand across Asia. But we now, in the last year or so, have seen increased demand from European institutions, predominantly insurers. And interestingly enough, what we're finding is that in Europe, they are dealing with regulations related to Solvency II. And as part of that Solvency II legislation, there is a lower capital ratio required for any securities that are infrastructure related. Given that the infrastructure market in Europe is really at its infancy, the U.S. municipal bond market has been an interesting option for them. And, what we're looking at here is the fact that munis just don't show high correlations to other asset classes, particularly U.S. equities, as well as foreign equities, and then even to U.S. Treasuries. So, on the investment grade side of the market, you'll find that, the correlation to equities is quite low. Domestic equities are represented by the S&P 500 here at just 0.04. And then if we look at the correlation to treasuries, we're at 0.44. On the high yield side, we have a bit of a flip-flop there where you'll have a slightly higher correlation to equities at 0.22 for the S&P, and then just 0.05 to U.S. Treasuries. So really what they've come to learn that munis are is really a pure play on the U.S. economy. They find that they own so many different bonds, whether they're U.S. corporate bonds or even other securities that have some exposure, whether directly or indirectly, to the U.S. stock market, and also show such high correlations to the general market. I will go back 1 second here. Show such high correlations to the general market. You think back to the oil shocks of 2015. You think back to, Christina discussed Brexit. You look at the high correlations that we saw across various asset classes during that period of time, and municipals just don't participate in that. So the more they become educated on the asset class, the more that they find that the convexity of municipals is something that they really want to own. And demand from unis here year to date has been pretty good because, sorry about that, I'm having a little difficulty. There we go. Has been pretty good, particularly on the longer end of the curve. So I mentioned there were about $10.7 billion worth of inflows into muni mutual funds. About $14 billion of that went into long investment grade products. And here we are showing, the difference in the U.S. Treasury curve versus what we're seeing in munis. So while we've seen some significant flattening in the Treasury curve, we haven't necessarily seen this in the muni space. So if I look at, I know Christina mentioned looking at the 3 months, but we'll do 2s10s and 10s30s here for a moment. But if we look at the 2s10s in the Treasury market, we're looking at a 23 basis points yield differential. If we're doing 10s30s, we're looking at just 17 basis points. That compares to 60 basis points for the 2s10s in the muni space and 76 basis points in the 10s30s. So you're still being compensated for taking duration risk in the muni market, even though we have seen that significant spread compression in the muni space here year to date. We still believe that there is value. And our viewpoint is as people really, get closer to tax season and towards the end of the year, and they start paying attention to how the tax bill actually affected them personally. We hear a lot about it being a tax cut. We think that it was more so a tax cut for corporations. At the individual level, it will be very dependent on your tax bracket. And while the brackets are larger, you have things like the SALT cap deductions, and there are increased personal deductions. So it should be interesting to see how this actually affects people, particularly in the higher tax states. I live in New York, and I'm pretty sure that it's not going to be a good thing for me personally. And so, we believe that as we get closer to year end, we're likely to see increased demand for munis for that reason. And here we're looking at the yields that many of the foreign investors and typically U.S. retail investors will look at based on their tax bracket. But what we continue to see is that municipals do offer a yield that is very compelling relative to the taxable space. We still have yet to see the healthcare reform that's been discussed. That 3.8% American Affordable Care Act tax is still levied on all net investment income. On the taxable space, communities continue to be, exempt from that, and that's where we're getting that 40.8 at the highest tax bracket as we add that 3.8 to the 37%. But what we're seeing here is the fact that until we think that gets repealed, there's definitely still some significant demand for munis, and we expect to see that demand increase over time. And, I discussed a bit about the tax reform potential effects. We have seen the reduced supply, for 2018 based on what we saw at the end of 2017. Again, the corporate tax rates have had the biggest impact at the individual level. That still remains to be seen. When it comes to the way that we approach the market at Invesco, I mentioned the essential services. We like having the dedicated stream of revenue in the actual projects. If you take the time to understand the projects, you can take a very educated purchase and be able to put the cash flows to work in bonds that we truly feel strongly about. And right now we continue to see some pretty good yields. Recently we just to give you some sense of where we are in the market, we bought on the high yield side a double B land district not too long ago at about a 450. We bought some University of Miami paper at about a 360. Long AMT airports at about a 360 as well. A-rated hospitals coming to market in the high threes, almost 4%. So there's still value in the muni market, and we expect to see continued strength. We expect to see a slight uptick in issuance as we get through the end of the summer here. But our expectation is that for the last couple of months of this year, issuance will be net negative when we consider the maturities and the calls that will be coming out of the market. And that is it for me. If we would like to take questions.
Great. Yeah, thank you so much, Stephanie. And so we will move into the sort of formal Q&A here. So if any of the attendees do have questions, feel free to type those into the questions box in the question section. We'll present those as they come in. But to get us started, Stephanie, you mentioned foreign investors playing a role. What's your view on the long-term repercussions of foreign investors coming into the muni market?
Thanks. That's a pretty good question. I do get that pretty often. Our viewpoint is that right now, we have seen a significant increase, but on an absolute basis, their position in the market continues to be quite small. But we do think that as time goes on, given the large amount of assets that these types of investors tend to have, we're talking multi-billion-dollar portfolios. We actually recently had a conversation with a Taiwanese insurer that internally has bought has bought over the last, I believe, 12 months or so, $8 billion worth of munis on a direct basis. And they've come to understand that investing in the muni market is not as simple as they thought. So now they're looking for an external manager. But there's a lot of assets, outside of the U.S. that, they're looking for homes. Rates continue to be very low domestically in these countries. And so our viewpoint is that while currently we've seen more interest from these investors from the taxable space, we do believe that long term there is opportunity for them to come into the tax exempt space. And once they do that, they can potentially change the liquidity pattern of the muni market. So, munis are very well known for being retail dominated. And once retail decides the asset class is out of favor, you tend to have a very strong sell-off. Our view is that, when this type of sell-off occurs in the future, and in the future, honestly, this could take quite a while. It could be, it's definitely years. I would say sometime in the next decade, we're likely to see a buyer base that could be buying when retail is selling, and that could increase the liquidity parameters of munis, and result in less price deceleration, acceleration towards the negative, I should say, when we see those sell-offs. So we actually think it's a net positive over the long term. It's just that it will take some time to get there.
Wow, great. Thank you. Christina, we got one coming in for you. What can states do to proactively kind of brace themselves with regards to some of these issues that you saw we are trending towards? Any advice?
Sure. I think that first of all, there are a lot of cautionary tales that can be learned from this, and I think one critical lesson is the importance of prudently taking on debt. We know debt can be just fabulous in terms of enabling entities, be it states or federal governments, in order to take on projects, make capital investments. But we're reminded that debt can be onerous. And that's also just an important understanding in terms of thinking about the populace of a state. You know, there are a lot of households that are taking on more debt than they can handle, or that they can handle now but may not be able to handle in the future. So states need to recognize that this could be a significant threat to fiscal revenues down the line, could create a higher rate of bankruptcies, et cetera. And I think in general, just states need to also recognize that we're in an environment where rates are going up. And there are advantages to that, but there are also disadvantages to that. So for the time being, it's still going to be hard to source income, to find adequate income, because this is a gradual process as rates go up. And so, you know, that's certainly a consideration as well. But I think just to recognize that in the future, borrowing costs are going to be higher, I think is important to think about. And also, of course, just recognizing that right now we're in a strong growth environment. This is a time to prepare for downturns as opposed to when we hit downturns. I think if a lot of states had been given the opportunity and had been given a warning that the global financial crisis would be hitting in 2008, they may have spent 2007, which was a good economic environment, preparing for that. So hopefully that was helpful. I don't know if there's anything specifically that anyone wanted to ask.
Yeah, thank you so much, Christina. I haven't received any more questions currently, so we'll give just a minute or two more for if anyone out there has anything to ask of Christina or Stephanie, please type that in. But in the meantime, do you all have any sort of closing thoughts or final words of advice for us?
Well, I would just add that one of the things I'm so impressed with is states as a tool for public good. I try to follow a lot of the different states in terms of efforts along the lines of financial literacy, et cetera. And I hats off, I can't say enough good things to many state governments that have done a lot, because I think the way we weather the next recession has a lot to do with how well we prepare our citizens for it. And so to the extent that they're doing that, they're doing God's work, and I think it'll ultimately help dull the pain of a recession. We know that recessions can be inevitable. We don't know when they're going to happen, but we know at some point they will happen, and so that's just something to keep in mind.
And I would echo that. You know, on the muni side, we always like to say that we can feel good about investing because things happen at the state and local level that at this point in time aren't happening at the federal level. You know, we see, you know, budgets getting passed. You know, people have to get together on a bipartisan basis, and we definitely value that, and we value, you know, the fact that these things do take place, and we don't have to deal with many of the issues that we're currently having to deal with on a federal level. So I would definitely echo many of Christina's sentiments.
Well, that's very wonderful. Thank you both. And I'm not seeing any more questions coming in. We are getting some kind words from the audience, just thanking both of you for participating today, and I'll echo that and just extend NAS's thanks once again to the speakers for leading the discussion on the topic, and for the audience out there for tuning in. It was very interesting and informative, and we greatly appreciate the time and effort that it took to prepare and meet with us. So thanks again to everyone for participating, and I hope everyone has a great evening.
Thank you.